Okay, I think we'll get started with our second part. If you need a cup of coffee, you're probably out of luck because you guys drank most of the coffee already. I couldn't find too many thermoses that still had some coffee left in them, so you might have to switch to water. Or tea. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the development of the first buildings. And one of the surprising things about early Christianity is, as far as we can tell, they don't have buildings of their own that are exclusively set aside for church things for quite a while. Not until the 200s in Syria and the Far East. The oldest churches that we have are from the 250s, I think. 240s, 250s. Now, it's a little bit complicated. Archaeology is like this because it doesn't necessarily mean that nothing was built before that. What it does mean is that we don't have any of the remains of them. We don't have evidence so far that there were earlier Christian buildings. But sometimes you discover that things change. There was a discovery a couple days ago in Germany of this metal scroll thing that they unrolled with a computer and were able to read. They figured out that it was written in ancient Greek, and it attests to a Christian presence north of the Alps between 50 and 100 years before they thought the first missionaries arrived. And so, again, I would say that the traditional story of Christianity and some of the martyrs that have been preserved in the church were proved far more accurate than the historical records. But we do know that the early Christians were not very fond in the beginning of building buildings. Some of it is probably because in the climate where Christianity began, it was fairly warm and you spent more of your time outside. They did far less inside than we are used to. But eventually they do start building churches. Now, before that, again, what did they use? And the best answer I can give you is I don't know. It seems likely that some people that had larger estates or larger homes would let the Christians gather there, that they would have kind of house churches. If you've heard of house churches before, that was a thing. But even then, that didn't likely start right away in this period, probably because of persecution. There's a bit of mystery to it. But one of the oldest structures that we have that we know the Christians themselves built is the first set of catacombs. And the oldest set are the catacombs of St. Callistus. They're called St. Callistus. I think he's one of the people that is buried there. And they're a bit of a feature of Roman geography. So Rome is built on top of this kind of volcanic soil, but it's sort of like gravel. The ground underneath the city it's not like solid bedrock. It's not, you have to take a pickaxe and tink out, chunks of rock one at a time. It's a material that's more loosely held together. It's some kind of volcanic soil. I forget what they call it. But what the Christians started to do is to build these cities of the dead. In the beginning, they weren't all that huge, but now, if you go to Rome, going into the catacombs is one of the great things that you can do. You can walk down in them and take a tour of some of them, and you can see. One of the things that you'll discover very, very quickly is the catacombs were not built for large groups of people, like to be in large groups of the living. Some of them have a few chapels and areas where there's a little bit more of a carve out. There's one of them, when I was in Rome, we went to the catacombs of Priscilla, it's called. Priscilla or something like that. And they were a little bit further outside of the city. They're a little bit more preserved than the catacombs of St. Callistus. And there's far fewer tourists that make the trek out to those than these. So you get to see a little bit more of the authentic thing without waiting in line. But what they do is they carve a road through a side, and then there's walls on either side of you, and then they would carve out niches in the walls. And they weren't very large. I think at most they're 6 feet long, and they're probably only about 18 inches or 24 inches tall. They're quite narrow, and they're just one after another. Like they'd be stacked 4 or 5 or 6 high on both sides. And after they put a body in them, they sealed them in some way. Most of the time, I think they used a kind of plaster tile that they would put over the front of it. So the sort of classic image of the catacombs, like I put on the next page, on page 78, when there were people in them, they didn't look like that. When there were people in them, they were covered with tile. But over the centuries, many of those tiles were removed. In the cases of the catacombs that the church still controls, they actually took the bodies, or the remains that were there, and buried them in another section of the catacombs that is closed to the public, so that they would still have their resting place, but that you could see it. Some of the bones were borrowed or stolen or something by other people, because again, the early martyrs were kind of the heroes of the faith. They're the stories that are told, and relics were a big thing, and there's a little bit of the pagan world is involved in this a little bit. Pagans have idols, pagans have all of these different things that they worship, and there's probably a bit of a blending in early Christianity that happens at first. And some of it eventually, like some of the metalsmiths and those that would work on these pagan idols, changed to make more Christian things, especially after the Edict of Milan and once paganism was outlawed in the 380s. But it's a little bit uneasy at first. So you can see how there's niches in the sides of the walls, and they're like this for miles. The largest catacombs, there's something like 40 to 60,000 people that were buried there. And they sort of build it backwards from what you would think. So the oldest graves are close to the surface. And what happens over time is they dig out further and further, and eventually they loop around and they come back through, and it's just a little bit eerie. Like when we were on the tour, at one point they have this little overlook, and you could see down into 2 more levels below us. So we were walking through one, and there was another one like 30 or 40 feet below us, and there was another one below that you could just see a little flickering light in. And it's like, how deep does this thing go? I mean, they're not the kind of place that without a tour guide and the light bulbs you'd want to spend a lot of time. At least as a modern person, because it's like, they're solemn. The catacombs are also where we have the earliest examples of Christian art that we'll talk about in a little bit, and I show you some of those pictures. But it is important that you know that this is partially because of the Roman soil. It wasn't hard bedrock. It is this kind of, you can't quite crumble it away with your fingers, but pretty close. And so that's just like the city of Rome. What did they do outside of Rome? Some of this is a little bit lost to the mists of history, but there is this transition that's happening to the care of their dead. So in the world that Christianity is beginning to grow, paganism is fairly widespread, and the Romans usually cremated their dead. They just burned them. This is part of the reason why the church didn't allow cremation for the longest time, because the pagans cremated their dead. Why? Because once you were dead, there was no more point, really. Like, that was the end of your life. That was sort of a final conclusion. Some of them had a little bit of a view of Hades, and maybe your life could get a little bit better if people would pray for you, but they didn't have a lot of hope. And so they just burned their dead and they didn't really care for their remains. That wasn't as much of a thing. Wealthy families would, and they would have these mausoleums and, cemeteries, but that was expensive. Most people were just burned, cremated. And Christianity comes along, and there's a fundamentally different stance with death because of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. That's a massive change. So those who have died, this belief that there is a future resurrection that will come and that the bodies of the dead will be raised, that shapes why Christians have a care for their dead. Now, maybe could someone, I think a door is open over there. The kids are practicing for their Christmas play program. Yeah, I think it's actually from the door because they're practicing in the church. Probably with microphones on. So Christianity has this new relationship with the dead, that those who are dead are still alive, that we care for their bodies. This is, like I said, this is the reason why for the longest time the church was against cremation. I think that lasts for almost 1900 years. Until the early 1900s, at least in the States. Because it's like that was what the pagans did because the pagans don't have the hope of resurrection. Christians do, and so the human body became this place of encounter with God. The human body was a temple of the Holy Spirit. And so you treat the human body like you would something of holiness, like you would something of God Himself. And so Christians carried this new view of death, that the dead are alive, especially those who are martyrs. They share in the victory of Christ over death. That develops very, very early. There's a little bit of this funny thing that okay, to go to heaven you have to be a martyr. And it's like, well, what if you're not a martyr? Well, maybe you can go to heaven, sort of. That was sort of like you were victorious, you achieved your end that you were aiming for when they killed you as a martyr. And there's something about that that's a little bit maybe too much in that direction. And I think it's important to see how one of the things that happens in early Christianity is there's this deposit of faith. There are 7 sacraments, there's priests and deacons and bishops and all these other things that are part of the church, but not everything changes right away. Not all of it comes about from the very beginning. Like the earliest Christians didn't have tabernacles. They didn't have a place where they reserved the Eucharist. After a Mass, they consumed all of the sacred elements that were there. And it was only from reflecting on the reality of the presence of Christ in the Eucharist that they're like, well, maybe we should do something about this. Maybe we should do something different. That was the genesis for tabernacles and why they had them. And originally, they were just to take care of Holy Communion that was going to be taken out and given to the sick. They were a place to reserve Holy Communion for those who were sick. It wasn't to have sort of this presence of God with us like we have the sensibility about in our churches today. A lot of those kind of things develop over time as they reflect on the reality of the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. The care of the dead happens in the same way. As they reflect on what the resurrection means, on the hope of future resurrection, on the coming glory of the kingdom of God, it starts to change how they bury their dead and what they do with them. And I think that it points to the connection, like one of the things that we could see in the sacramental life, and I think this is a very Catholic principle, and it's also very, very helpful, is how God uses material things and they become a place of encounter for us. So in baptism, what happens? You pour water over a baby's head. It's a physical sign, but it also is something that conveys grace. You have this connection between what is spiritual and what is material, and that God uses certain material things to convey grace, to convey his presence. This is the whole pattern of creation. God speaks in the very beginning, and he creates with a word. But after creation, the people that he entrusts with sort of continuing and beautifying his creation are humans. And so we're called to work with our hands, to become agents of the Lord, to cooperate in his desire, to cooperate in his plan. Angels are like this as well. God works through the ministry of angels. So Christmas time, we have the great story of the angel Gabriel who appears to Mary to tell her that she would become the mother of Jesus. Could God have done it himself? Certainly. But he doesn't. He chooses to work through the creatures that he has made, and that becomes part of their dignity. Like that's part of his gift, part of the way that he gives himself to the rest of us, and the way that he pours out his love is he chooses to work through creation and to work through his creatures. And so this kind of unity between body and soul, between what is physical and what is spiritual, runs like a golden thread through so much of the Christian teaching. It connects so many things. This is part of where the sacramental system, the sacramental economy comes from in the church, but it's also part of why our bodies are important, why we shouldn't just neglect them, why we have postures for prayer and postures for other things. And I think if you start to see that the body, the physical world, becomes a place of real encounter with the love of God, it starts to make sense why you would care for the bodies of those who were deceased differently. I'm not exactly sure how early the practice of praying for those who have died stretches, if it's back to this point in the 200s and 300s. But I think that that stream of thought develops very early in Christianity as well, that we don't always know the hearts of people, and so we pray for those who have died, that they would live and dwell in communion with God. So that's a part of this idea of burying the dead and caring for them as well, is that they become people who we pray for. And so the Christians, in a particular way, begin to take special care of the tombs of the martyrs. Very, very quickly, they start to preserve places where the martyrs died. Not always a physical building. They had a tendency eventually to knock it down and build a church there, but they're usually in the same place. And they would celebrate liturgies on the tombs of the martyrs. This is the origin of the practice of having relics in the altar. That an altar is made out of stone, because the tombs were usually made out of stone at this time, and that there would be relics in them. It comes from this early practice, care for the tombs of the martyrs. These are held up as the heroes of the faith and kind of lionized, and so the Christians would gather around their tombs. Now, having said that, we know that they couldn't have all been buried in catacombs, because you can't really gather around a tomb or celebrate a mass very easily on a tomb when it's cut into a wall in a little tiny narrow road. Like, that doesn't work very well. But these cemeteries are the earliest Christian things, the earliest Christian buildings that we have that are in the West. The earliest ones, the earliest physical churches happen in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, probably in Syria, in very rural places in Syria, in the 250s. So the oldest church buildings that we have are from that time. Sometimes they took advantage of earlier construction. This is one of the other things that's a little bit mind-boggling to Christians today, and to people today, is that they tended, if a building was well built, they tended just to repurpose it. So, in a sense, once Christianity becomes legal, lots of pagan temples get converted to Christian churches. So one of the oldest churches now, for instance, in the city of Rome, is the Pantheon. If you go there, it's a round church. It's like they built it to be the walls and stuff hold this perfect sphere. It was the largest freestanding dome, I think, for many hundreds of years. And there's a giant hole in the middle of it. If you've ever seen pictures of one of the liturgies, I forget what day it is, but they drop a bunch of rose petals through the hole in the dome and they fall down in the middle of the church. It's called the Pantheon. That was a temple to Jupiter and all of the Roman gods. And the Christians eventually consecrated it as a church and took all the pagan idols out and put their own statues and altars in. And it's there to this day. You can go inside of it. That's an old pagan temple. And so they do start to borrow some of the things that were there already, but as nearly as we can tell, they didn't do that until the Edict of Milan in the West. So that's in 313, and we're not quite there yet. The Christians, where did they meet then? We know that they met, we know that they gathered, but they seem to have used large houses or estates. One of the other things to recall is that society is very, very stratified. So the poor in this time are very, very poor, and the rich are very, very rich. So a wealthy person might own 1,000 slaves. You know, there would be like 1,000 or 1,500 people that worked on an estate. And you can imagine that if you have 1,000 people working on an estate, those estates would be very large. Regular homes were very, very tiny, the places where most people lived. But they do seem to have used some of them. I don't know that we have any still standing examples of these early house churches. Some of it is probably that the widespread persecutions of Diocletian destroyed them. We talked about Diocletian last time. And that most significant of persecutions. But it seems like the Christians didn't build as many things until a little bit later. So one example that I wanted to highlight is called the Basilica of Saints Cosmas and Damian. This is one that I've actually been in, celebrated Mass there with Father Matt Kramer and Father Sean Mulligan and some other people. So this is also part of where you can feel a bit of the tortured history of some of these early buildings. So there was a Roman temple that was built in the Forum to a god. I forget, I think this one was a Jupiter temple or someone else. I don't remember. But there was a Roman temple, and it's not exactly clear who it was dedicated to, and it was built in the 300s. The Christians later come in and consecrate that Roman temple as a church to the martyrs Saints Cosmas and Damian, who actually died in Syria. They're two early doctors. They were known for not charging for their services frequently, and they end up becoming Christian martyrs, and they become patrons of just about everything connected with medicine. If you're dealing with health problems, St. Cosmas and Damian are good friends to have. They're two brothers, I believe, if not twins. So there's this pagan temple. It's later consecrated as a church, and then they add on to it and they build kind of a new entrance. And so there's a pagan temple on one side closer to the Forum. There's a church kind of attached to it, and there were parts of the pagan temple that were used in the church, and then parts weren't really. So they do it, they make this beautiful mosaic. So mosaic is a kind of art where you take little chips of rock or different colored things and you set them in plaster. And mosaic is really, really fascinating because it has so much texture and it kind of glitters in the light because of how light is captured by different bits of rocks or glass differently. So this is a very famous mosaic of Jesus preaching. I think there's another one of Jesus the Good Shepherd, maybe in the same building, and he's carrying a lamb, and that is another important thing. So there's pagan temple, there's Christian church sort of next to it. They kind of build a separate entrance. That happened in 527. They start adding pieces of art. They build altars. The altar that you can see in the picture with the 4 pillars, that is Baroque art style, which means that happens in the Counter-Reformation. One of the things, so that's like hundreds, thousands of years later, 1,000 years after they've been using this as a church, someone added an altar to it with pillars like that, and some of those artistic features, those kind of arches, I believe that's Baroque. And Baroque is like post-Reformation, post-1500s, much, much later. Early Christian altars tended to be rather boring, actually. They were often just a chunk of stone. I mean, they would carve them and they would make them nice, but they weren't these gigantic edifices that we like to imagine in a lot of cases. In the 1900s, so eventually, I guess, there was a restoration. Parts of the temple were kind of collapsing. Parts of the church were kind of collapsing. So they raised the floor 21 feet. How do you do that? I don't even know, but they did. So it's weird now because you walk into the church and like the pagan temple is sort of below you and behind you. But somehow, at one point, they were closer to the same level. That floor was raised. And then in the 1900s, they restored it again, and they sort of separated off, so the pagan temple is kind of now in its own area on the other side of some walls, and the Christian church is in another area on the other side of some walls. And eventually, because the Italian government, I think, wanted to preserve this temple as an example of early Roman architecture, more of the temple was put back. I think they put back a statue of Romulus in it. Maybe it was a temple to Romulus the whole time, but it's sort of like you can see how this is a little bit different than what we have in some instances. Maybe it's more like Ben Franklin, where you have this process of growing by accretion. There's an old building and they just start adding to it. Sometimes the new pieces don't really work with the old ones, so they sort of make it work and jerry-rig it and that kind of stuff to make it kind of happen. And then because of modern sensibilities, they start trying to put things back and they make the part of it. I mean, it's a museum now, more kind of thing than an active pagan temple, but it's on the other side of the church. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think we have the documents for them in the office. She asked what relics are in our altar here at Holy Spirit. We do have a relic of St. Peregrine, but it's in the shadow box on the wall. I don't know if there's a relic of St. Peregrine in the altar. Some people have asked now in the past, now there's a congregation of women religious nuns outside of the city of Rome that kind of takes care of relics for the church. So that's a place where relics are collected from those who have been canonized. And then when new churches are founded or a new altar is being consecrated and they need relics, the bishop can write to that congregation and they'll send relics for the altar. So if you go to places like St. Anne and Joachim, they actually did it there where you can see a little window on the back of the altar where the relics are. Now they've changed, the idea of it has changed a little bit, so instead of putting them in the top of the altar, in the table as they call it, they put them underneath more. But yes, I would have to look at which relics are actually in our altar.
Father, how are the relics classified? Isn't there like 4 classifications?
Well, this is also one of the things that modern science is going to drive us a little bit crazy with. So in traditional Christianity, or in the traditional mindset, there were 3 classes of relics as far as I know. First class relics were parts, bones, physical things from the saint themselves. Second class relics were things that they touched or used or wore. And then third class relics were the things that were touched to them or things that were near them, like places kind of stuff. But I would say that modern science is messing this up a little bit because there's things that we're discovering. Like, for instance, women who have children carry some of their children's DNA inside of them all the time. Now, because they know where to look, they can actually get the genetic sequence for your kids from you as a woman. And think about that with Mary. Like, that has kind of stunning implications for Mary, that she, for her entire life, actually carried part of Jesus with her in a physical sense. But this is also true of things, for instance, like the clothing that saints wore and the different things that they had. Like some of the modern saints, I have a friend who has a somewhat distant relative named Mother Marie Léonie Paradis. And she's going to be canonized shortly, I think, or she has been canonized now. But because she was a relative, she wrote to Mother's congregation, and they sent her some second-class relics, but they're actually pieces of the habit that she wore. They had cut it up into little squares, and they made second-class relics out of them. But if you've ever washed clothes or looked at clothes, you know that humans shed crazy amounts of skin and stuff. And so your clothing is also literally drenched with and covered in parts of you. So is it a second-class relic or is it a first-class relic? You see how it makes things a little bit more complicated. Now, there's a different sensibility about it too. At some point, we do have to talk about relics and Christianity because there's some strange things. But for modern saints, they're a lot more careful with relics than with older saints that they used to have. So like St. Thomas Aquinas, after he died, they boiled him so they could cook all his flesh off and get his bones, and then they started breaking his bones into pieces. And it's kind of a sad story. For modern saints to preserve the integrity of their body, if someone's been canonized, they'll take like a rib bone. They'll take a bone that isn't as structurally important. St. John Paul II, most of the relics for him are from blood that was saved from some of his surgeries. He had to have surgery a few times, and they took some of his blood for future transfusions or different things. And some doctor had the mentality that we should probably keep this around. And so most of the relics of St. John Paul II were from little bits of his blood that was put on a cloth. So they're much more careful about what they take from saints now, but it is a part of Christianity, and it's not always clean and neat and orderly like we would have in the modern day German West. And so my hope in describing this Basilica of Saints Cosmas and Damian, it's not quite from this early time period. One of the incredible things, though, if you go to Rome today,